From a security guard prowling a dark factory at night, and apparitions seen in a school, to a terrifying incident in a morgue, and a lone officer who finds himself in a derelict building. But is he really alone? This episode is pure nightmare fuel. But before we get into the stories, if you were to accidentally press the like button or accidentally subscribe to the channel, I'm just going to say it's probably not something you'd go on to regret. Just putting it out there. But now, onto the stories. I'm your host, Severed Soul. Officer Jimmy Barnes and his partner were working the night shift in rural Illinois when they received an unexpected and somewhat unusual call. It was a break-in at the local morgue of all places. Not exactly the most common place for criminal activity. However, considering the chemical substances that were stored there, it wasn't outside the realms of possibility that drug addicts might be interested. So, they took the call and made their way to the morgue. Okay, so being alone in factories and building sites at night would be as scary as hell. But being alone in a morgue at night, now that would be absolutely shit your pants terrifying. So, when the officers arrived, the custodian was already waiting for them outside, and he was quite visibly shaken and distressed. He was shaking and stuttering as he explained, to the best of his ability, that while he was mopping the floors, he noticed something moving in his peripheral vision. When he looked up, he saw what he could only describe as a person running across the hallway before disappearing into a room. The problem was the lights were off while he was cleaning, so he couldn't really get a clear look at who it was. Okay, who the hell mops the floor of a morgue at night with the lights off? Seriously. Anyway, feeling vulnerable and exposed, he thought best to call the police. Now at first, the officers suspected it could have been kids messing around, or maybe the custodian had just been seeing things in the dark. But he seemed undeniably certain about what he'd seen and convinced them to investigate. The two officers entered the morgue and began calling out to anyone who might be inside. The only answer they received was the echo of their own voices. With the custodian leading the way, the officers started walking down the main corridor, checking the side rooms as they went. Each room revealed nothing unusual. Labs for analysis, storage for tools, and paperwork. As they proceeded, they switched on the lights, wanting to make sure they didn't miss anything. Officer Barnes came to a dark room, fumbling the light switch. Once the room was lit, he saw that it was just a waiting area for relatives of the deceased. So he quickly swept the room, checking every last little spot where someone could have been hiding. Now, just as he finished, he heard his partner's voice cut through the silence abruptly. He was shouting, "Hey, stop, turn around." Turning quickly, Barnes saw his partner standing in the hallway with his gun drawn, pointing towards the end of the corridor. "She went around the corner," his partner explained, motioning to the left. The custodian, now standing beside them, informed the officers that the left side led to a dead end, so there was absolutely no way out. Realising they had the intruder cornered, the officers moved towards the end of the corridor, reassuring her that she would be safe if she surrendered. So Barnes peeked his head around the corner and saw a woman, clear as day, standing at the end of the hallway. Now, it was too dark to make out any facial features, but he could make out her long, fair hair. Trying his best to de-escalate the situation, he stepped forward, hoping to speak with her. But as soon as she noticed him, she quickly opened a large grey door behind her and darted through it, slamming it shut. Barnes hurried to the door and pulled at the handle frantically, only to find it locked. He then banged on the door, calling out for her to come out, but there was absolutely no response. Both his partner and the custodian joined him, and after hearing what had happened, the custodian seemed somewhat perplexed. You see, he explained to the officers that the door couldn't be locked from the inside. It wasn't possible. With growing unease, the custodian unlocked the door and the officers entered, weapons drawn. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing an empty room. And in that moment, the temperature plummeted. It felt freezing cold even for a morgue. The space mostly just comprised of workspaces lining the walls, equipment scattered around, and two gurneys in the centre. One of those gurneys was covered by a sheet, a body-shaped lump beneath it. The officers immediately suspected that the woman was hiding underneath the sheet. But as they approached, as they got closer to the gurney, they began to notice a sickening stench in the air. It was the unmistakable smell of decay. Realising something definitely wasn't right, Barnes pulled back the sheet. To their horror, underneath was the very woman they had just been chasing, an identity tag dangling from her big toe. And according to the tag, the woman had died 4 days earlier. In the summer of 1993, a police officer on a night patrol came across a truly bizarre situation at a local junior high school. It was around 3 o'clock in the morning, and as usual, Officer Pete Rogers was cruising quietly through the neighbourhood trying to catch people up to no good. When he finally reached the school, however, he noticed something strange. A door on the west side of the cafeteria appeared to be slightly ajar. Using his binoculars, he confirmed his suspicions and called it in as a security check for a possible break-in. So, after scaling a 6-foot fence, Rogers walked into the school grounds and noticed straight away that the cafeteria door had been propped open with a wooden door jamb. Unsure if someone had left it that way on purpose or if it was an accident, Rogers decided to err on the side of caution and called for backup to help with the search of the building. And soon, 2 other officers had joined him. Together, they began searching the school, starting with the cafeteria. They cautiously moved through the hallways, cleared the gym, locker rooms, and the band hall. As they searched, they kept in contact with dispatch to see if any alarms had gone off. Now, dispatch informed them that motion had only been detected in the areas of the school that they had already checked. However, and this is a whopping great big however, while Rogers and the other officers were waiting in the main hallway for the school security officer to arrive, they suddenly heard footsteps echoing from the 3rd hallway on the east wing. Now, immediately thinking it could possibly be a burglary, they formed up and moved down the hallway as quietly as they could, checking each door along the way. When they reached the end of the hallway, they found the exterior doors chained shut. Now this is where it gets creepy. As they scanned the area with their flashlights, they heard a huge clatter. Shining their lights in the general direction of the noise, they could see that a student desk had been tipped over. It was at this point that a small girl appeared, stepping out in front of them. Rogers claimed that the girl was around 4'10" with blonde braids, and she was wearing a red dress that definitely didn't look like a modern-day garment. She just kind of stood there, staring, smiling at them, completely ignoring their commands to get down. After a few seconds, she casually walked across the hall and into the classroom. The officers, both shocked and determined, followed her into the classroom, giving warnings as they went in. Now, Rogers swears blind that they searched that room thoroughly, checking under desks, inside closets, even looking inside the ceiling tiles. The windows were locked, and there was no way in or out other than the door that they'd entered through. But that girl was gone. Now, it just didn't make any sense. Their colleagues outside radioed in to check in on them, and the officers inside the school shared a look of complete disbelief. Now, these officers definitely weren't the kind of men to believe in ghosts, but there was just absolutely no explanation for what had just happened. However, if you think that's where the story ends, you're wrong, because as they continued down the hallway, the girl reappeared. She stepped out from the same classroom, smiled again, and ran back inside. The officers, who were now both scared and frustrated, once again rushed in after her, and once again, as you might have guessed, the room was completely empty. As the officers moved back towards the main hallway, they saw a light turn on near the main office and library. Thinking the school security officer had finally arrived, they hurried towards the light. But just as quickly as the light had turned on, it turned off again. When the security officer did finally arrive and entered into the building, understandably, the officers were ready with more than a few questions of their own. Calmly, and somewhat unexpectedly, the guard asked the officers, "So, which one did you see then, the boy or the girl?" Now, very confused, Rogers explained that they'd seen a little girl in a red dress. The guard just kind of chuckled to himself and then proceeded to inform the officers that the school had indeed been haunted for years. He mentioned that many staff members and students had reported seeing the girl, while a little boy ghost was often spotted in the library, sometimes also appearing in the principal's office. Now, it wasn't the first time something like this had happened there, and the officers realised they encountered something far stranger than a burglary. In the years that followed, Rogers would experience more strange encounters during his time on the job, often in schools at night. Even though he wasn't really the type to believe in ghosts, those experiences stayed with him, reminding him that sometimes burglars and trespassers weren't the only problems he might encounter on the job. In the early 1980s, before becoming a state police officer, Stephen Walton worked security on the night shift at a large, quiet factory. Now, he wasn't really the type to buy into superstitions and would often dismiss anything supernatural with the simple, "I don't mess with that stuff" sort of response. However, the story he told from his time working at the factory carried a tone of seriousness that made it hard to brush off. In fact, he was always reluctant to share the story, and the way he told it made it clear it had left a long impression on him. So, into the story itself. His job was fairly solitary, as I'm sure you can imagine, and the majority of the time, the factory was dark during his shift. I was actually chatting in the comments on one of my previous videos about this kind of scenario. Not a chance would you get me working a night shift on my own in a factory or building site. I have read way too many ghost stories for that. Not a chance. Every little noise would have me like, that's definitely a poltergeist, or that's a demon coming to steal my soul. Yeah, that's not for me, thanks. Anyway, he had a small room where he could watch TV or listen to the radio, but every hour he was required to patrol the factory. So, armed with only a flashlight, he would walk through the silent rows of machinery, peeking down the aisles, making sure everything was as it should be. No, just stay in your office, Walter. Trust me, it's safe in there. The factory was vast and always creepy at night. But one particular night, something just seemed off. Bloody hell, here we go. So, as he stepped out of his room for a routine patrol, he noticed something different as his eyes began to adjust to the darkness. Something that definitely shouldn't have been there. In the main hallway, a shadow moved in a way that was hard to explain. It wasn't just a trick of the light or an odd reflection. There was something dark moving around in the surrounding area. And it was shifting around completely unnaturally in a way that really caught his attention. So he paused, letting his eyes fully adjust, but as they did, the shadows seemed to disappear. Now convinced he was probably just imagining things, he swept the hallway with his flashlight and saw nothing else out of the ordinary. Still, slightly unnerved, he continued his patrol, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching him. So, as he walked down the long rows of the factory, everything appeared normal, though he could still definitely sense that there was an ominous feeling in the air. The darkness of the factory itself was enough to keep anyone on edge, especially on a night as quiet as this one. When he finally reached the end of the row, there was a large open area that led to the main door at the entrance of the building. Now, normally, a light would illuminate that door, but for some reason, on this night, the light wasn't working. There was still a faint glow from the moon, casting long, indistinct shadows across the floor, and he could feel his body starting to tremble as the anxiety started to take hold. The change in lighting felt wrong, ominous even, so instead of investigating further, he decided to turn back towards the main row and head for his room. However, as he made his way back, something caught his eye, and this is where the story gets creepy. In his peripheral vision on his right side, he saw what appeared to be a tall, cloaked figure. It was human-like in shape, but dark and indistinct, and it was lurking at the edge of the row just beyond the shadows. So he raised his flashlight towards the area where he'd seen the figure, and if you think this is one of those stories where the figure had just disappeared, well, you'd be wrong. Because when his flashlight lit up the end of the row, it became clear that this was not just his imagination. It was there, tall and motionless, with a shape that was unmistakably human, though cloaked in shadow. In a state of complete shock at the sight of this, well, whatever it was, he wisely decided not to stop and investigate further. Instead, he kept walking, keeping the figure in his peripheral vision until he reached his room. Once inside, he locked the door and stayed there until daylight, refusing to leave or even glance outside. The experience had been all too unnerving to brush off. When morning came, he left the factory and immediately called his boss to let him know that he wouldn't be coming back. And, unsurprisingly, that was the very last time he ever set foot in that building. And that's all we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed the stories. Please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. And as I said earlier, if you were to accidentally hit the like button or subscribe to the channel, you probably won't regret it. Thanks for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.